So, moving on, we'll have our next panel on stage, and we'll be moving across the pond. I'm very much looking forward to handing over to the host of the next session, Trishan Paruma, CEO of Hubject North America. And with his guests, he's going to be discussing unlocking roaming and reliability in the US, a discussion on the digital infrastructure required for EVs at scale. So, welcome, Trishan.
Well, thank you, Joanna, for the introduction. Hi, everyone. I know it's warm. I know it's the second day, and everyone probably had a big night last night, but I want to feel the energy in the room, so we'll get excited. We've got 3 guests that have come from across the pond. I'm really excited to have our panel today where we discuss roaming and reliability in the United States. Many of you don't know that the market has really ramped up in the last 18 months even. We've got private sector, public sector experience on this panel. We're going to get into a really thorough discussion about how do we scale EVs in the US. But before we begin, I'd just like to say a quick thank you. A lot of effort went into getting our panelists here today and getting this panel assembled. So very much a big thank you to Brad Groders, our Director of Policy, Candace Clark from the Moving On team, and Simon Zhu, who couldn't be here today. Also a big thank you also to the Energy Commission of California for being here today. So I'd now like to welcome our panelists onto stage, and then I'll give a quick overview of their bio before getting into some presentations and Q&A. Let's go.
Come all the way down? Okay.
All right. Yeah, gentlemen, please take a seat. So first, closest to me, we have John Smart from the ChargeX Consortium. John of the Idaho National Laboratory is the director of the National Charging Experience Consortium, also known as ChargeX. ChargeX convenes national laboratories and private industry to measure and improve reliability and usability of public EV charging infrastructure. Previously, John served in the Joint Office of Energy and Transportation, helping to launch the office and establish its standards and reliability program. Prior to the Joint Office, he spent 14 years at NIL and 6 years at the Ford Motor Company. John earned a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering from Brigham Young University and an MBA from Boise State University. I thought we were going to have a table, but that's fine. We'll just...
All right.
Welcome, John. Next, we have Dustin Schell from the California Energy Commission, sitting farthest away from me. Dustin is a staff engineer in the CEC's Fuel and Transportation Division. The CEC is California's main agency for deploying electric vehicle charging infrastructure. Dustin is the CEC's technical lead on the EV charger reliability, working with federal and international partners. He's also the primary author of the CEC's forthcoming regulation on tracking and improving reliability for California's EV charging. Prior to coming to the CEC, Dustin worked at the California Air Resources Board, developing and deploying systems to detect high-emitting diesel vehicles operating on California's roadway. Welcome, Dustin. And last but not least, we have Rahul Gupta from Moving On. Rahul is a global executive strategy advisor and member of the board of directors of Moving On. For over 35 years, Rahul has provided a unique brand of collaboration and co-creation in strategy, innovation, transformation and technology, integration expertise to government and business leaders across 4 continents. Rahul's also worked in critical infrastructure, transportation, telecommunications, cybersecurity, and intelligent operations with the US government and on US congressional and presidential commissions. In addition, he's also worked in the private sector and served many national and global practice leadership roles at PRTM, PwC, Deloitte, and Accenture. Rahul, welcome.
Thank you.
So let's give a big round of applause to our guests. They've come a long way to be here with you, and we're really excited to get into the discussion. So before we begin, I'd like to just give you a quick overview and place some context on the discussion today of what Hubject's doing in North America. Thank you, John. A quick introduction to Hubject North America. We have our headquarters in Los Angeles, California. We operate the same global platforms that you see in 60 other countries across the globe. Our roaming platform and our plug and charge platform. A team of 10 supports our business in the US, Canada, and Mexico. We launched our roaming hub last year in North America, and we've now got 15 networks. It should be at about 20 networks by the end of the year. 9 out of the top 10 networks are using plug and charge in the US, which is very much a high penetration of the plug and charge ISO 15118 adoption. And finally, we're working with the same OEMs you see us working with all over the world. So super excited that in the last few years we've seen a ramp up in the United States, and particularly at Hubject we've seen a lot of the same trends that we've seen in other markets. However, there are some unique challenges that we have in our market, and we're looking forward to discussing that. I'd really like to frame today around headlines and treadlines. What we've found is that the headlines, much like here in Europe, are often paint EVs and EV charging in a negative light. But if you look at the data, if you look into the trend lines, we're actually seeing a different story. We're still growing. There's some growing pains, there's some challenges which I'd love to discuss with our panelists today. But I just wanted to highlight a few things that show you that the market is trending in the right direction. We recently had an announcement from the Biden-Harris administration that within the last 4 years that public charges have doubled within the United States. California, and we have the CEC here today, actually 25% of new vehicle sales are zero-emission vehicles. Compare that to some markets here or across the world, that is a high penetration of EV adoption. You'd be surprised to know that the oil and gas state of Texas is actually the #1 producer of wind energy and the #2 producer of solar energy in the country. And believe it or not, we actually have 40 or so charging networks, which is increased substantially in the last few years. We've had Iona, a joint venture similar to Ionity here in Europe, start in the US. And we've also had players like Walmart come in. I'm looking forward to discussing that with the panel as well. Plug and charge, as I mentioned, is the norm for a lot of networks and a lot of OEMs. And e-roaming and network roaming hubs have become more part of the conversation in recent years. Today's panel, I'd like you to reflect on what does the ideal charging experience actually look like. Really, from a driver perspective, we've got to think about how can we find charging points in one single app? How can we make sure that chargers are available anytime, anywhere when we need them? How can we make it seamless so the driver doesn't have to rifle through, I have 9 apps in my phone to charge on separate networks, or RFID cards, or figure out how they actually pay for charging. And finally, we want all charging stations to be safe. I want my data to be safe, and we want it to be secure. The key challenges we see in North America are quite similar to what you see in every other market. However, how we address them, I believe, is slightly different. The challenges remain around accessibility to charging, reliability, which this conference is all about, and data quality, and of course, interoperability. With that, I'd love to hand to John Smart from the ChargeX Consortium to have a few words.
Thanks, Trishan. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. I'm honored to represent the U.S. Department of Energy and the national laboratory that I work for, called Idaho National Laboratory. I have a great job as an independent technical expert or a manager of a team of technical experts. We're able to talk with companies all across the industry to understand from each stakeholder's perspective what the main challenges are with charging today. So I'm pleased to talk to you about what efforts are happening, funded by the US government, to improve the public charging experience in North America. We've talked about it a little bit already, but I want to make sure everyone in the audience understands what's happening in the US with respect to public funding. There is now unprecedented funding from the US federal government available for charging infrastructure, thanks to the bipartisan infrastructure law that passed in late 2021. That law established 2 major programs for funding. One is called the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Formula Program, or NEVI. Second is the Charging and Fueling Infrastructure Discretionary Grant Program. That's a long, bureaucratic-sounding name, but we call it CFI for short. Together, they provide up to $7.5 billion for charging infrastructure deployment, operation, and maintenance in the United States. And in case you didn't know, this has never happened before. This is an order of magnitude higher funding than has ever been available in the US before. So we're very excited about what this means for increasing charging availability for all Americans. Not only did the federal government want to provide funding, but they also wanted to provide support, technical support for CPOs, automakers, and all the stakeholders in the industry. And to do that, we created the ChargeX Consortium, or the National Charging Experience Consortium. It's led by 3 national laboratories: Idaho National Laboratory, which is my own, also Argonne National Laboratory in Chicago, and National Renewable Energy Laboratory in Denver. We have a vision that any driver of any EV can charge on any charger and have it work the first time, every time. Seems simple, right? No, we're all here because we know that's a huge challenge. So we brought together industry leaders, the national laboratories, consumer advocates to make sure we understand the voice of the customer, and many other stakeholders with a mission to significantly improve charging reliability with a deadline of June of 2025. We started June 2023, so the government gave us 2 years to make a big difference, and we're well on our way to doing that. Why did the national labs get involved? Because many of the problems that exist today cannot be solved by any single company. The problems transcend the sphere of influence or the span of control of any one company. The labs are here to bring those companies together and to tackle the complex issues that require cross-stakeholder collaboration. We're primarily focused on the DC fast charging use case because, like in Europe, in the US, that's where most of the technical problems lie. We're specifically focused on the interface between the charger and the EV. That includes the connector on the charger side, the inlet on the vehicle side, and an adapter in between. Because of the opening of the Tesla Supercharger network and the creation of the J3400 standard, the Tesla-style connector and inlet are now being produced by other auto manufacturers and charging providers. However, it will take some time for those products to make it to the field, so a number of aftermarket manufacturers are producing adapters to fit between a CCS connector on one side and a J3400 or Tesla connector on the other side. There's a lot of engineering and safety concerns about the proliferation of adapters, so we're digging into that problem to make sure that customers are protected. Second, we're taking a hard look at the communication between EVs and chargers. Is there enough information being shared between the two? And the short answer is no. There needs to be more information about performance, about diagnostics, what went wrong, and where problems lie. Finally, we're working hard to increase the scalability of interoperability testing. As you all know, there are many, many EV makes and models on the market, and there will only be more to come. Likewise, there are many, many brands, makes, and models of chargers. In order to make sure that every vehicle works with every charger, right now in the US, and I think in Europe, companies are testing one by one. That's not scalable. We have to do better than that. In addition, we're responding to a US national priority, which is vehicle grid integration, by introducing the AC Level 2 smart charging use case to our work, to ensure that not only does public charging work, but residential charging works when the charging is deferred or delayed overnight. When I plug my car in at night, I don't care when it charges, as long as the battery's full when I want to leave tomorrow morning. That reliability is huge to make sure that that happens while still providing value to the grid. Here's a list of the participants in the consortium. There are 87 different organizations in addition to the national labs participating. This is on our website, so you don't need to memorize it, but suffice to say that it's a who's who of the leaders involved in the industry in the US. Finally, one thing that we've learned in our work so far over the last year, there's a large data gap between the stakeholders on the charging side and on the vehicle side in the US market. We need to bridge that gap creatively and collaboratively in order to fix the problems that are barriers to a positive customer experience. I look forward to talking to you more about that with the panel. Just click next when you're ready.
That's me.
And I'd like to welcome Dustin Shell from the California Energy Commission.
Thanks, Trishan. So hi, Dustin Shell. I'm a staff engineer in the California Energy Commission, commonly referred to as the CEC. As Trishan pointed out, we're the lead agency in California for energy planning and policy, and part of that is ensuring that we're achieving California's goals for deploying EV chargers throughout the state. Before I get into the presentation, I just want to kind of level set with some numbers. Trishan mentioned 25% ZEV penetration through Q2 of this year. We're up to 150,000 chargers installed throughout the state. Our projected need through 2030 is about 1 million chargers in the state, and we're currently projecting a budget of $1.5 billion of investment in California public dollars in EV charging through fiscal year 27-28. So thinking about those numbers and the types of investment that are going on in California, the CEC is very focused on improving the charging experience. We have a number of efforts around that. Some of these efforts are very direct: reliability requirements, payment and roaming requirements, some field testing. Some of them are more indirect, where we're requiring data collection on inventory and utilization, and that will just help us better model and forecast needs and direct investments in the future. So this is kind of the meat and potatoes of my slides. It's hard for me to talk about this because I'm the primary author of these regulations, so I tend to get too deep in the weeds. I'll try not to do that here. That being said, this is a proposed regulation at this time. We've been working on it for 2 years. We hope to finalize it mid next year at the latest. These things take time, as we all know. And I think kind of there's a lot of information here, so I'm just going to focus on some of the key differences between what we're proposing to require and the NEVI requirements. First and foremost, these are only specific to publicly funded chargers in the future. But we defined uptime and then an additional metric, which is a successful charge attempt rate. Colloquially, we call it SCAR. And we define those very granularly through OCPP messages. And then we're requiring publicly funded chargers to be certified at OCPP, as well as the backend CSMS to be certified at OCPP. They'll be required to calculate the metrics, report them to us on a quarterly basis, and then additionally, charging network providers, or EVSPs, commonly I think is the term in Europe, will be required to transmit their OCPP logs in batch loads every 60 minutes. So we also have a 97% minimum uptime requirement. We also have a 90% minimum SCAR requirement. And then in addition to all of the requirements we have around reliability, we also have requirements for publicly available chargers that are publicly funded. They must also share certain data with third parties for free around price, availability, and accessibility of the chargers. And that one in particular we think will really help to start opening up to third-party data aggregators. So some other efforts, I touched on these briefly. We are looking at a utilization data collection effort. This will improve our modeling and forecasting and support grid planning and better direct our investments. We also have some pricing and roaming efforts that we're working on. These are very early on. Very relevant to that, the legislation passed that requires us to set those regulations, specifies that all publicly available chargers in California, irrespective of funding, have to be ISO 15118 plug-in charge capable, which we think is a pretty big deal and will help move the ball forward on interoperability. Finally, field testing. Well, I'm sorry, I should say something about roaming. We are very supportive of roaming generally, although there's some things that are in flux right now, so I can't talk about it very explicitly a lot. We don't have a lot that I can get into publicly on roaming, unfortunately. Sorry, Trishan. But more to come on roaming in California. And then we also very much believe in field testing. So we've contracted the University of California at Davis to test 3,600 chargers from the customer's perspective throughout California. And that's looking at everything, the accessibility from a perspective of navigation all the way up to could I plug in and successfully charge my vehicle. One additional deliverable from that contract is a protocol that can be picked up and taken by other research organizations to further field test chargers in other geographies, hopefully to start building a much larger standardized data set to really understand the state of reliability in North America at least. We're also exploring an EM&V program, which is evaluation, measurement, and verification, and that's just a standard program to ensure that publicly funded projects are doing what they say they're going to do. Finally, the CEC is committed to improving the charging experience, and we're primarily doing that through standardization. We want standardized enforceable reliability requirements, standardized field testing protocols, and we're pushing the industry through our funding requirements to coalesce around standardized communication protocols. And with that, I will pass it over to Rahul.
Rahul Gupta from Moving On, please.
Thank you. I think this is a great setup by having John and Dustin kind of give you an idea of what's going on. I'll walk you through what is moving on, who is moving on, and then what we are seeing in the marketplace. So Moving On, it's a outfit started by Michelin. And our purpose is stated on the slide. And in the United States, we're going to be a not-for-profit, which allows us to talk to the public sector, the private sector, the academia, and the community organizations to bring what these two gentlemen are trying to build at scale. So truly a unified force for sustainable mobility. You can see the executive members, and you can see the Moving On members, and we're adding them regularly. So it's a European and a North American capability brought together. And I couldn't do this without my co-conspirator, Candace Cluck. Hi, Candace. So if you want to talk to us, please reach out to us after this conversation. I'm going to talk about the customer and the consumer. They have had 125 years of learned behavior. And unlearning that behavior is going to take all of us. So what is today's behavior that we are trying to fix, right? So internal combustion engine, notification, you got navigation, and in the United States, there are about 180,000 gas stations, and each station has up to 12 to 16 pumps, and it's every corner. So you never have to worry about such a thing as anxiety. What type of anxiety? Fueling, you select your fuel, you make your payment, cash or whatever, and then what you get is effectively a very happy person that says, hey, thumbs up, I'm good, right? Now what we have to do is to think about new behavior. That new behavior requires a new business model. And those business model is complicated. So what you're hearing from my colleagues, and I got my start in the federal government 30 years ago looking at these activities, and I'm surprised that we are where we are, but I'm also pleasantly surprised that we've made some progress. So 1, notify. 2, low battery, please charge. It's not the same thing as internal combustion engine. 2, we're gonna start looking at navigate to the station. Yeah, I don't see one, right? I have to locate it. Well, I have to check if it's working or not. Is it compatible? What is the brand of my car? What payment system do I have? And maybe I can schedule and reserve it, right? Then I'm going to go charge, confirm the connection, potential use adapter, and then pay and settle. This is very different for somebody that's been conditioned for 150 years, where we've built an entire transportation supply chain logistics system to make it simple. Charger operator, utility settlement, everything I've heard this morning. So, the person is like, what gives? It's not working. At least it's not working based on the experience. Even it's 11% or 20% depending on who you speak to. So I'm going to introduce something different. It's called functional availability. It's interoperability, it's reliability, but it is the purpose with which you're going to build a business model. It's functionally doing for what it is designed for. It's purpose fully built. So what does that look like? Sorry, Trishan, I tried to copy you, but any resemblance to anybody in the audience is just purely coincidental, right? You're going to have to have the digital infrastructure.
No,
you're going to have concierge services, IoT smart infrastructure, EV infrastructure. I'm going to build this slide to tell you the magic that's happening behind the scenes. And if it's not happening behind the scenes, that means you're not getting the experience that's happening, right? And we build, and we build, and we build, and we build, because this is what an app, and whether you're on Apple or whether you're on Android, this is what people are expecting, right? And all of this is happening behind the scenes, whether we like it or not. And boom. Eventually, we get to the user experience in the business that's what we want. And these are not random musings, right? We got to ask ourselves, what are the right questions on behalf of the consumer? It's not just what is the technology, what are the standards. These are all critical functions. But if you're going to build a business model that's going to fundamentally transform how we move sustainably, those are the questions we have to ask. Would my mother or my father or somebody who is not technically adept say, you know what, it's okay. I used to go to the gas station and now I have to figure out what again? I don't think so. That is why the amount of money that we're spending on this topic is going to be key. Is technology overweighted? All of this is going to take expertise versus the customer behavior. What are some of the things we need to start teaching at the age of 5, 6, 7 so that the next 100 years we're learning a brand new behavior? What is the proper transition? What is the proper business model for it? Is this a system of system? Are we talking a convergence? Or are we just talking about walled gardens as opposed to a very large public park where everybody collaborates and talks and works together? And then what is the investment that needs to be made in the physical infrastructure, right? We're not just going to pour asphalt and concrete. You need to put sensing fiber. You need to put IoT sensors. We need to talk about cybersecurity. We need to talk about IoT systems. And then, is it just L2, L3, or through the road, inductive charging? Maybe we need to have smaller batteries that never go below 20%. I don't know. I don't know what the right thing is, but it could be all of the above, right? And we all want to get there fast. And the person who set us all up, maybe I'm showing my age, is Doc and Marty McFly from Back to the Future, right? Do you remember this movie? Do you remember the DeLorean where you could do it?
1.21
and there we are.
gigawatts.
There we got.
Great
And there
start.
is your 1.2 gigawatt, which should be gigawatt, right? But we want to get there fast. Thank you.
Sorry, Rahul, I scooped your joke.
Well, thank you to our panelists for those presentations. I'm looking forward to the discussion. For the audience, I'd just like to say we now have plenty of time to discuss with the panel the presentations and the market in the US, how it's evolving. We'll save about 10 minutes at the end for audience questions, so whether you'd like to submit that digitally, online, or we'll have a roaming mic, no pun intended, at the end of the presentation. So, gentlemen, I'd like to start with, we kind of got a gauge of how much money is being spent on infrastructure and the EV adoption. Rahul, you mentioned even the Back to the Future analogy. I'd be really interested if we were if we're in the future where EVs are at 100% or everyone's driving clean energy vehicles, and we would have set that dial back in time to 2024. Where do you guys think we are in the journey? What's improved, so what's worked well, and what needs to be fixed? I'll start with John and then hand to the other panelists.
One thing I'm really encouraged by is the level of maturity of the technology itself, particularly for fast chargers. Compared to gasoline fueling infrastructure, fast charging technology is, to state the obvious, dramatically different, right? And everyone in this audience appreciates that, but very few average citizens do, right? Why can't it just work? Well, there's to provide power at such high levels with the sophisticated communication that communicates with every possible car. In any event, charger manufacturers have come a long way in providing a sophisticated, reliable product. The charge point operators that are coming to market right now are taking advantage of that. And there's also a qualified workforce that has a lot of experience working over the last 15 years with different companies that were pioneers. Those individuals are now moving to some of the newer CPOs. And what we now call legacy CPOs, which is kind of ironic because they're not very old, like Electrify America, EVgo, ChargePoint, have also dramatically increase their sophistication when it comes to operations. It used to be that when charge point operators installed chargers, we say set, they followed the idea of set and forget. We installed it, you use it, great, it'll work. And now those companies have learned there's a lot more work that needs to happen to constantly support the maintenance and operation of those stations. So improvement of technology, improvement of the workforce, and improvement of the business operations are all to the point where I really think that now, 2024, the market is ready to take off.
Thank you.
I would agree with that. Maybe a visual, right? Think about a very large snake, and you gotta actually have that snake empty what's in its stomach and to swallow something bigger. So we're talking about 285 million single-use vehicle and many more other in terms of Class 7, Class 8. You have to replace that entire ecosystem, and you have to condition that ecosystem to absorb something brand new. So we're going to move from dino juice, right, diesel, gasoline, to electrons. And to do that, the adoption rate has to accelerate to the point where that angst is gone. I never believed in range anxiety. I always believed in charging anxiety, because if on average you travel in the US, large country, 60 miles, you don't need 300 miles, which is what the public perception is that you need at a minimum. But if I don't have to worry about, hey, it says charge, and I can see plenty of charging stations, and I know that it's going to be as reliable, and thank you to CEC for getting the numbers pushed, and John to actually innovating in that space. I think we're not quite at the inflection point. So if you think about the curve, and then there's a knee in the curve where it takes off, I think we're getting close to it, because that public park doesn't exist. It's still a bunch of walled gardens, right? I've got this ecosystem, I got this ecosystem. But being able to connect horizontally rather than just vertically is the critical part. So as soon as we can get that convergence that's horizontal, we will get to that inflection curve. And I think we're about 4, 5, maybe 6 years away. But I see that rate of change accelerating, because people realize I'm better off selling 1 million SKUs than 100,000 SKUs. But it's going to take a whole bunch of convergence and integration and interoperability to make that work. Because that's the functional availability is the key, right? It's not just reliability, it's not just interoperability. Is it fit for purpose?
Yeah,
Dustin, please.
thanks. I think I'd agree with and build on some of what Rahul said. You know, so we had 25% ZEV sales in California through Q2 of 24. But if you look at the total population of EVs in California, it's still, I think, 3.8%. So it's still very low. I don't think we're to the inflection point yet. And I do think public perception is one of our bigger challenges right now. You know, when I first started looking at reliability, EV charger reliability for the CEC about 3 years ago now, everybody's got tons of anecdotes, but there's nothing out there that's really concrete that anyone can point to. There's a very limited number of publicly available data sets, and you can make criticisms about those all day. But, you know, so I think we are at a good place. We're starting to see a ramp up. I think that we still need a lot more public dollars going into it to get us to a point where the industry can be self-sustaining and not relying on those public dollars anymore. Maybe 5 or 6 years, maybe a little bit more than that. But I still think we're in a very good place.
I want to ask you, when you say 4, 5, 6 years, you know, what I'm seeing in the United States is, if you take California, for example, it's a good example of how the rest of the country may evolve in the terms of, I live in Orange County. EV penetration there is very high. In other parts of California, you may not even see an EV. How are we making sure that the country is electrifying at the same rate? Because what I see is that a lot of the larger cities are electrifying. We're seeing funding now going to things like NEVI, but I'd love to get a perception of how that funding is being used and where it's going and how we can support the country to electrify.
Traditionally, EVs, solar panels, clean energy technology has been more quickly adopted on the coasts, East Coast and West Coast, and the middle of the country has been slower. That may follow political leanings as well, when you think about people being conservative or progressive. It also has to do with climate. And typically the West Coast down to the Southwest, all across to the south to Florida, the warmer climates are ones where electric vehicles have historically done well. I live in the Northwest, in Idaho, in the mountains. We get winter for 6 months of the year. And so I see up to a 50% reduction in the range of my own EV in the harsh winter. And so that does affect people's willingness to purchase or interest. Raul used the word need. People need to charge. In the U.S., customers don't think that way. What do I need? It's what do I want, right? Americans are all about what I want to do, what I want to do. You get out of my way, right? and we sell people buy a lot of trucks and a lot of SUVs, very large vehicles, because gasoline is still relatively inexpensive, and they buy the vehicle that can do everything they ever want to do. I have a trailer, I tow it 3, 4, 5 times a year, but I want a truck because I never know when I'm going to tow my trailer, right? And so it's going to be a little while before the mix of vehicles on the market satisfies all Americans that live in different areas. Yeah. So I don't think we'll ever get to a situation where there's uniform adoption across the U.S. That's maybe one thing that makes the states great, is that they're each unique. But we are growing from the centers, from the coasts, and that is creating a trend that others are beginning to follow.
I think it's a great question, right? So I've been fortunate to see the two coasts for a while now, but in the last year and a half, I've been asked by the state of Oklahoma, a red state, who knew politics could play a role in transportation. North Carolina, Florida, Maryland, where these Secretary of DOTs are calling us and said, I need capacity and capability. This is technical. There's telecom, there's cybersecurity, there's privacy, there's utility, there's a car, there's all kinds of elements that me as in public sector I may not be used to, right? Because I get money to pour concrete and asphalt, but now I have to worry about putting sensors in. I mean, who knew that a road needs to be different? So I'm seeing curious questions. I'm seeing the OEMs putting battery plants and EV manufacturing in red states. Once again, who knew politics could play a role? But I would agree with John that California leads the way, Massachusetts adopts, New York follows, and we're talking about the 5th, 7th, and 11th largest economies in the world coming together, doing something, and then quickly everybody adopts. But for me, it's simple. Does Ford have, or Stellantis, or VW, do they have enough money to do a EV architecture, a nice architecture, and a hybrid architecture? Absolutely not. So they're going to have to pick one. And the private sector is going to start pushing public policy in the United States, saying, you know what, invest in public infrastructure, because we're not the ones about the road. But if you do all the right things and you put the money where the need is or the want is, we'll follow we've invested. They've invested $1 trillion. They can't waste it.
Yeah. I completely agree. I think for me, when the Ford F-150 Lightning came out, and Rahul, I know we've talked about this, they advertised it during the Super Bowl, I think 2 years ago maybe. I started getting a lot of questions about EVs from people that had previously told me they'd never consider it. And I think, I'd love to talk about the behavioral aspect as well. John, you touched on it. But before we do, Dustin, I do want to ask you the same question, but also maybe for the audience, the international audience, you could frame the role that the CEC plays and how the difference between kind of federal and state regulation in the United States. Because from my perspective, I think and people from the outside, it's a little bit challenging to understand, what role, for example, the CEC plays at a state level and what role the federal government plays compared to other regions like Europe.
Sure. Wow, what a hard question. So, in terms of the role that the CEC plays, we are a part of the executive branch of the state government in the state of California. Pulling out from that and looking at America as a whole, America is a collection of states that are united to form one federal government, but each of those states is fairly autonomous. It's probably somewhat analogous to the EU versus member states in a lot of very real ways. So within each state, we have a fair amount of latitude and authority, and there are things we have authority over that the federal government doesn't have authority over. So it's Byzantine and hard to understand, and would take a lot longer for me to get any deeper into it than that. Suffice to say, that does, I think, drive some of the differences between the states, going back to your original question, although the cultural differences are very big as well. America's huge. I think the landmass of continental United States is larger than the EU as a whole. So it's just a very big place. There's broad swaths of open land where you might see, a collection of 10 buildings as you drive for 5 hours, right? And I think that actually, as John and Rahul were answering, I think that's one of the bigger drivers of slower adoption in some of the more conservative areas. Rural areas tend to be more conservative, and they also tend to have a lot further spaces between any goods and services, especially charging. And so when you think about it, those folks are thinking about it in terms of, well, what if I need to get my mom to the hospital? The hospital's 4 hours away. Yeah. What if I need to, whatever other emergency, I'm failing to think of other examples, but I think that's a huge driver of it. And that applies in California as well. California, within a very large nation, is a very large state. And we have a lot of very big rural areas that happen to, frankly, be very conservative. And what we at the CEC are doing is developing specific rural solicitations. I think what John did when he was at the joint office with NEVI, where they set it on building out specific corridors for long distance travel, was very smart, right? And it established a good baseline for, if you're on the major corridors, you're gonna find charging.
And Dustin, by corridors, you mean interstate highways, right?
That's what I meant.
Federal.
Well, yes, federal highways that are managed and maintained by the states. But
highways.
Right. Right. So yeah, major roadways to move away from American-specific jargon. So yeah, I think those areas are always going to be slower to adopt because they have very real fears and very real concerns about EVs, and that goes back to the perception problem in the media. The perception of poor reliability. Quite frankly, we hear about it a lot, but there's very little tangible data that we can take to the public and say, no, look, public, it's really like this, or it is as bad as you think it is. I don't, so not to take opportunity to advertise our work too much, but that is one of the big things about that UC Davis study, and that was one of the first things that I tried to get going. Took a little while, but it's boots on the ground, people out testing chargers, using a standardized protocol from the perspective of the customer, what happened. And those type of things, hopefully we can grow that into a larger program to verify things moving forward, and others will pick it up and do the same with it as well. But real data is gonna be crucial, real data that we can share, right? I hear things from stakeholders in the industry that, well, we have this data set that shows this. It's like, okay, cool, can I share that with the public? No, okay, well, so we need something that we could take to the public and change that perception.
So I'm hearing customer experience and is very different in the United States, and I think we've painted a good picture of that. Dustin, I want to stay with you just to understand, you talked about standardization. What roles do standards have in shaping the customer experience then?
Yeah, well, ideally, they will never have a role that the customer is aware of. But I think it all goes kind of loosely, you could say interoperability, right? Disparate systems working well together, and everybody. Tons of smart engineers throughout the industry can come up with novel solutions. There's a million ways to solve tons of different problems, but you have to get it all to work together. And the fastest way to do that is standardization. And so I view it as crucial to a lot of the problems that we face in the North American charging industry.
To me, the elephant in the room is all the other players. Rahul, you had a great chart up there with all the different pieces, right? I'm seeing OEMs being involved, software companies, Hubject included. You have, like you said, telecom, cybersecurity, utilities, big, small CPOs. Rahul, I'll start with you, but I'd love to get your perspective. How do you build consensus between all these public and private players of varying sizes, varying knowledge, completely disparate industries coming together, really?
Yep. I think that is probably the elephant in the room, right? So if we go back to the theory of change, what is the value that is being generated, and why are people going to adopt this transformation and adapt to it, right? So the theory of change is that sustainability is critical for the planet and the climate change. And you have to start thinking greenhouse gas emissions, scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, sustainability, development goals, and whatnot. This is all very abstract for the average person. But it's not abstract for everyone who's investing in it because they want to see a change. This is why, for the very first time, we've had an infrastructure bill. The first time I worked on infrastructure bill was in 1995 when I was on Capitol Hill. And it took 30 years before we got something over here. But what drove it is the public consciousness that something must be done, right? So the ecosystem is coming together through a combination of the public investment, private understanding that there are policy and strategic imperatives that large companies cannot avoid. Right? It started in the EU. The US is adopting many of those requirements. California is saying, well, I don't care what the rest of the government, the federal states do. This is what we're going to do, right? So you're already starting to see the policy implications that are transpiring into the business. And the last piece I would say is a business imperative. You can take the $10 billion settlement that VW and Dieselgate did, and you can go build a new diesel car, or you can realize that your business is going to disappear because there's someone else on the other side of the continent. They've completely bought into it, right? We've got a great presence from BYD, which started with the Berkshire Hathaway, Warren Buffett investment. So people are recognizing that there is a public and a private coming together, and there's a role for the public sector to invest in those activities that the private sector won't do. And the elephant in the room, I think, is that ecosystem, the convergence of multiple capabilities that need to come together. In the United States, there's 3,500 utilities, right? How do you actually bring all of them together if all of a sudden they're left behind and everybody has the ability to go to somebody else, their business is gone. So I'm seeing that tension come together where people are coalescing around, you know what, we don't have a choice, we have to do this. And that's why I think it's growing, and then there will be that hockey stick, right? And then as soon as that hockey stick happens because the public infrastructure is working, and then we have functional availability, people are gonna say, you know what, a $30,000 US car, I can buy EV or I can buy gas, it makes no difference, they're equal. Where do we get to that point? And I think that's when it flips.
So John, I'd like to get your perspective, because you had a slide with all the ChargeX participants, and I think a lot of them come from varying industries. I could imagine they have different motivations, different focus, and you're super honed in on reliability. So I'd like to ask you, why is ChargeX focused on reliability and not all the other, complex issues we've talked about in this ecosystem? And then how do you get all these industries to really laser focus on this issue and address it?
Yeah, I have always said reliability is step 0, right? If we can't get reliability right, we can't do anything else. customer confidence will disappear, the market will disappear, the industry will disappear. We've got to get reliability right. And of course, that's what we've been talking about for the last day and a half. So everyone agrees. The discussion in the US is very much the same as everything we've been talking about here. And I keep having to remind myself I'm in Germany because it sounds like the same discussion we have in the US. So that's the good news. The industry is recognizing the importance to get the chargers to work for any driver of any car, any charger, first time, every time, right? So the attention is there, the focus is there, people are working very hard. It's a privilege to work with so many different companies, as you've said. But you might remember my next slide was the Grand Canyon, the gap between the companies in the ecosystem. Maybe on the left side of the canyon was the charging or CPOs and the charger manufacturers. And on the right side of the canyon is the EMSPs and the automakers, sometimes are the same thing. There's so much work that needs to do to help for those companies to begin to communicating with each other more than just face-to-face or on the phone. Literally, I've heard from multiple companies that say, when I see in the data that there was a problem with charging, I literally, and I'm the automaker, I literally call on the phone the CPO and say, what happened? Can you show me the logs? This is 2024, we can do better than that, right? So the next frontier is digital integration, finding a way for all the companies in the ecosystem to share on an automated, real-time basis the data that they need to measure performance, to diagnose problems, to identify the root cause of the problem. Is it on the charger side? Is it on the vehicle side, right? And once we get all of that sorted, then we can get on to much greater value services. Like you talked about the ideal customer experience. Plug and charge is huge, right? That's an easier process than filling up your car with gas. And let's think bigger than that. I want my car to suggest to me where are the best places to charge. Where can I get the lowest price? I want my car to be negotiating price. And I want this, as a CPO, I want to be understanding which vehicles are coming to me, to predict demand, to work with my utility, to balance the load. All of these things that are make charging a greater value than the fueling system today are all contingent on or all require stellar reliability.
Thank you. I'd like to get to some audience questions. Before we do, I have one burning question. Rahul, you've worked on 4 continents, so in 30 seconds, what is the #1 lesson learned from other markets that in the United States we could say, if we could do that, that would help us a lot?
I think it's a sponsorship and a championship by both public sector and private sector leaders. The behavior in Hong Kong and Singapore was very different, but they all wanted Teslas. One was priced at 300% the price, and the other one was subsidized. In the Middle East, it's a recognition that we want to sell oil, we don't want to use oil. And it all started with sponsorship and championship by combined public sector and business sector leaders, because they understood this was the critical piece.
Thank you. Now I'd like to take some questions from the audience. A reminder that our government officials cannot answer any questions regarding the upcoming election. However, Rahul and I think, are comfortable to give you our opinion. Our public officials are, of course, happy to talk about any regulation and policy that's already in place.
Tristan, can I take the question on screen?
Yes, please, go ahead, John.
While they're thinking of theirs?
Yes.
So standardization takes a long time. How can we speed up the process? That's one of the things the ChargeX Consortium is focusing on, taking a hybrid approach. Standards development organizations like IEC or ISO in the US and others follow a consensus-based process. That's one reason they take forever. Everyone has to agree. In the ChargeX Consortium, we're identifying some of the problems within the standards, some of the ways that companies are varying their implementation. We get the team together, work out the technical details, and then the national labs have the opportunity to make the decision and put forth a recommendation to the standards community. Now, they, of course, then still have to get consensus, but we're trying to get 80% of the way there outside the standards committee so that it works much more quickly when it's brought to the committee.
Can I add
Dustin,
something to that?
please.
Yeah, so I want to take an opportunity to really boost something that the Joint Office of Energy and Transportation has funded in the US, which is the Everest project, which is a full open source implementation of OCPP and ISO 15118. I'm not super well versed on the full scope of that work, so that's all I'll say about that particular work. But I think that, yes, there are holes in the standards need to be improved, we need test cases, things everybody already knows, right? But if we can have an open source, fully built out implementation of those standards, then everybody has a baseline that they can go and look at and say, okay, well, does my implementation, does my product talk to that at least? And I think that that's a really awesome idea to move forward on. So
It's what these guys said, but I will also boost the business side of it. The faster you get to open source standard, the easier it is to then take business models from other industries. I remember VHS versus Betamax, GSM versus TDMA, CDMA. The EU said we'll do USB-C, not just Lightning. When that happens, there's that convergence, coalescence of various activities, and I think that's what's needed. So it's what they said, but I think there needs to be a boost by an outside party says, you know what, I'll take it on, because I'm actually making a bigger pond.
That's right.
For bigger fish, as opposed to a big fish in a small pond.
I would agree. I think it brings it all together, and one thing it does is allow smaller players, newer players to come into the marketplace, right? We have time for one question from the audience, so if you'd like to raise your hand, happy to take a question from the audience.
There's one here. Yeah, there.
I saw this gentleman here first, so we'll go with the gentleman in the black shirt.
Hi. It's great that the federal government is mandating plug and charge. Does the government also have a vision of how that ecosystem is supposed to work? Like who the MSP should be, how the pricing is negotiated, what that vision looks like? Maybe you could elaborate on that.
The federal government, the U.S. federal government will not require any of those things. That's for the market to decide. However, ChargeX and other government resources are being provided to develop the public key infrastructure that's necessary to identify and address problems with the standards, to help the companies come together to improve interoperability of EV to EVSE communication. So the business side of it, the market will decide, but we're trying to tackle and provide resources to help the industry to tackle the technical challenges.
What I can add to that is in the work we are doing with the various states who get the flow down from the federal government. You've got investor-led utilities that are working with the state to set a rate charge. You've got municipal utilities having that conversation. And then you've got the local business communities coming up with a consensus. So the federal government is playing a critical role, forcing the states' behavior to influence both the public adoption and the private sector behavior in that state.
If I may add, I think one of the key distinctions is typically standards like ISO 15118 are tied to public funding. So it's a little bit different to other markets where it's more of a broader regulation and the market has to adopt it. It's typically tied to funding, grants. But Dustin, I'm happy to get your perspective because...
Yeah, I think you may have been asking about something I said in my presentation. So we did have a legislation pass last summer that requires publicly available chargers to be plug and charge capable. Yes. However, that is where that piece of legislation stops. In terms of the how, as John said, typically within even state governments or the federal government in the US, we try not to tell people how. We generally set a performance standard, and actually even saying ISO 15118 in regulation or legislation is a big deal. It shows how far it shows how critical I think the public sector believes the coalescing around standards is. Because usually that's not something, at least in my experience, that you would see.
Yeah, I think that is a big achievement. We have run out of time. I feel like we could have gone for another hour, but maybe that means hopefully you'll have us back next year for round 2. I'd like to thank our panelists. John, Rahul, Dustin, thank you very much. We appreciate it. Let's give everyone a round of applause. Thank you very much.